Good morning, guys. So I've tried to add music because hopefully that will help you to find this a little bit more interesting anyways. So I wanted to try to talk through the next couple chapters. I kind of tried to combine them it'll be a couple of videos. Today we're going to focus mostly on Spain, Holland, and France during the 15 and 1600s and look at how the kings and queens had become rather corrupt, and eventually it's going to lead to the demise of many of these countries. So we're going to start with Spain. So this is Spain. So our story with Spain starts with a revival of their bitter enemy, the Ottoman Empire. So when we were talking about Spain last week, we looked at the idea of the Inquisition, where they were basically trying to drive out of Spain anybody who wasn't Catholic. This included the Muslims, who were called Moors, but also just any other heretics. Well, obviously, this is going to lead to a lot of resentment with this man with the lovely onion hat on his head over here. This is Suleiman the First. He's the head of the Ottoman Empire still. And he's going to be angry that his people had been treated so badly by the Spanish. And so he is going to be trying to vie against the King of Spain, who at this point in time is a guy by the name of Charles V. So Charles's last name is Habsburg. So the Habsburg dynasty is going to rule Spain. They're also going to rule Central Europe because of a whole series of marriages and stuff like that we don't need to get into. He was basically a king of a ton of land, right? He had colonies all over the place, including in parts of America like Florida and Arizona and New Mexico area. But he also controlled pieces of today's Italy, Austria, Holland, Germany. And so he's going to become not just king of Spain, but also king of the Holy Roman Empire. And it was the first time since Charlemagne that anybody had had that much land. So that's kind of impressive, but it's difficult because in all of those territories, there's a lot of different religions going on. And religion is going to be the main source of conflict for the foreseeable future. So just kind of accept that. In this case, Charles was Catholic, and he was going to continue to fight against the Muslims, such as we saw in the Spanish Inquisition. He is also going to fight against this rising wave of Lutheranism that Martin Luther is going to start with the Reformation. Charles realizes it's a losing battle for him, and so in 1555, he's going to issue what's called the Peace of Augsburg. Basically, he said, you know what, Germany, modern day Germany, I can't figure out how to rule you and to not fight about religion. And so I'm going to allow you to choose the religion of the territories. Like he's going to pick, like if you want to think of them as princes, they're going to control different regions, and each prince would get to say what religion. Well, for most of Germany, that's going to be Lutheran. And so ultimately, because his goal was to have this German Catholic state and he was unsuccessful, he winds up abdicating his throne, like quitting. Abdicate means to quit. He was king and he said, I quit, and he ran away and became a monk in a monastery. So now that means that his son Philip is going to have to take over. So Philip is going to take over all the colonies that his dad was in charge of. Philip was known to be very hardworking. He would put in, it was rumored, 18-hour days trying to figure out peace and more ways to claim more land for Spain, really trying to promote Spain as like the strongest empire in the world. It helps him that his uncle, who's king of Portugal, winds up dying shortly after Philip takes over and leaves Philip the throne. So Philip is going to take over Portugal and all of Portugal's empires as well. And Portugal has a ton of empires. I mean, all those explorers that you talked about, I know you talked about in junior high, you think Magellan, da Gama, Columbus, those names. I mean, all of them, at least in part, had a tie to Portugal. And so now Philip has this massive empire. But really, that's not always a good thing. It was so big that he had to try to spend tons and tons of money to try to keep peace in his empire. And most of his empire wasn't Catholic, so that doesn't make him super happy. Because he really wanted this giant Spanish Catholic empire all over the world. And that's not going to work. But he felt like he had to follow the work of his grandparents, Isabella and Ferdinand. These were the ones who funded Columbus's expedition to the U.S., right? 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue because he got money from these dudes. And so he kind of feels like he has to do the same. This is a torture scene. You can just ignore it. It's kind of creepy. I'm sorry. So he's going to try to be really, really passionate about converting a lot of people to Catholicism. And so in 1571, when the Pope asks all Catholics to fight against the Ottoman Empire, he's like, oh, we don't like Suleiman. Let's go get him. He's going to jump in wholeheartedly, right? Philip doesn't even question it. So Philip is going to launch his armada. His armada is a navy. And at this point, it was considered one of the best navies in the world. There was really only one navy that was superior, and that was Britain. Britain had historically continually been defeated by the armada, but Britain was smart. They learned from their mistakes. And so they had wound up like studying where they lost, like how they lost in these battles, and preparing themselves with longer range cannons so they could shoot at the Spanish Armada from farther away. Excuse me. So the Spanish weren't prepared for this, and they're going to get defeated. So the British are going to defeat what was at the time the strongest navy in the world, making Britain now the most powerful navy in the world. It's important to note, what religion is England during this time? Pausing to let you think. They're what's called Anglican. If you did the reading, then you read about King Henry VIII. Historically, England had been Catholic, but Henry VIII wanted a divorce, and the Pope refused to grant it to him because divorce was illegal in the Catholic faith. And so Henry's response was to break away from the Catholic Church and create his own Church of England, which is called Anglican. It's similar to Catholic, it just doesn't follow the Pope. It actually is going to wind up becoming its own offshoot. So it's still Christian. They still follow Jesus and those types of ideas, but they just don't listen to the Pope. In a couple of videos, we'll be talking about England. They had a man by the name of King James who's eventually going to come to power. He winds up editing the Bible to more accurately reflect England's wishes. And the King James Bible is the most common version of the Bible used across the world today. So England kind of does their own thing, and we'll get to them. Regardless, at this point, Spanish rule has really started to decimate. Now, their arts are going to flourish. They've got three important artists at this time. Dominicos Theochropoulos, this giant name. He was also known as El Greco, which means the Greek, even though he was technically born in Crete. He was a painter, and in most of his paintings, he emphasized the glory of the Catholic faith. Diego Velázquez emphasized the grandeur of the monarchy. He was actually paid by the monarchy and the royal family to paint like the royal portraits. He wasn't always super supportive of the monarchy, so a lot of his paintings, you can see where he is like subtly casting shade towards them. And we'll see one in a second. But it's satire, and it's hard to tell if you don't know a ton about the Spanish monarchy. And probably the most important book in Spain's history, Don Quixote de la Mancha, was written by Miguel de Cervantes at this time, and it was meant as a criticism of the rich. If you read or watch Man of La Mancha, that's what this is about. So that is an El Greco painting. You can see very elongated figures. They're all looking upwards towards the heavens. So very exalting of the church. This is Velázquez, and it's the royal family. This lady here kind of scares me. And then I don't have an excerpt from Man of La Mancha, though. I could have, sorry. Economically, they had big problems. Their money was backed by the amount of gold and silver that as a country they had, and so they were constantly on this quest to go find more gold and silver. which is the exact opposite of what you're supposed to do, because the value of your currency actually increases if you have less. It's an economics thing. If you don't understand why, you will understand it better when you get to Dreyfus, because he can explain econ a lot better. Just trust me that basically what happened in Spain was inflation. Their currency didn't match the value of the goods that people tried to buy. It also didn't help that the population continued to increase, which led to increased demand in products like food and clothes. And all that happened was the merchants saw this as an opportunity to get rich, increase their prices, making it so that people couldn't afford basic essentials. And so their economy was so bad that Philip is actually going to declare bankruptcy 3 different times throughout his rule. And this just kind of walks through all that happens. The biggest hurdle was that nobles did not have to pay taxes. And so the poor people were expected to pay for the bulk of the country. And that doesn't work. When you don't have a lot of wealth and to be asked to pay really, really high taxes, unfortunately, you couldn't make those payments. The country didn't have money coming in. Additionally, a lot of the Spanish artists wind up fleeing. So Spain is starting to crumble, and their colonies see that. So one of the most important colonies at the time is Holland. Okay, this is really confusing for people. What country today is called Holland? Okay, it's called the Netherlands. So the Netherlands, which are a small country next to France, is also partially called Holland. And if you're from there, you're Dutch. It's very confusing for people. So what is up with Holland? Here you go. All these words I just said. Yeah, why? I got nothing. So the problem with Holland is that historically the Dutch were a religion called Calvinism, which we don't need to get too much into. It's another type of Christianity. It's not as followed today, but like many of the pilgrims would have been Calvinists. So the Dutch were Calvinists. They didn't have very much in common with their Catholic Spanish superiors. Additionally, Spain had started to tax the Dutch very, very heavily because of the bankruptcy. The Dutch didn't like this, and so they're going to rebel. And in that rebellion, in one day alone, 1,500 Dutch peasants basically are killed trying to fight to not pay taxes towards a country they don't like. And so in this battle emerges a leader for the Dutch, a guy by the name of William of Orange. He's going to be really significant, so keep him in mind. Don't lose him. William of Orange was really smart. What he did was say, you know what? We need to fight politically for our freedom and keep religion off the table for now because we'll be able to draw more support. Basically, he thought that he didn't want to isolate anybody in Holland who might be Catholic or who might be Lutheran. He wanted all of those religions to team up to fight against the Spanish. And that was actually really, really smart on his part, and it is ultimately going to be successful. His goal was Dutch independence. The problem was he didn't have much military training, so he really had to be. He lost a bunch of battles and had to learn from those losses in order to become successful. Eventually, though, in a series of battles, Spain is going to lose. One of the most famous battles is the battle at Ledeen, where the Dutch were really kind of clever. If you know anything about the Netherlands, geographically, they're called the Low Country, one of the Low Countries, because geographically they're actually lower than sea level, but throughout time they had built a bunch of like levees and dikes and dams to protect them from flooding. Well, at this battle, what they did is they wound up leading the Spanish into a floodplain and then opened up the levees, flooding out the Spanish troops, killing most of them. So they just used their geography and their smarts, and it paid off. So within 5 years, the Netherlands gets its independence, part of the Netherlands. The Protestant part is going to break away, and that becomes today's Netherlands. Now, the lower part of Holland, they decided to stay with Spain for some time because they were Catholic, And so they were like, no, we'll stay with Spain. It's okay. Eventually, they're going to get their independence as Spain continues to crumble. That southern part is called Belgium today. So just here's a map. This is the Netherlands and Belgium, and then France. So the Netherlander government, see, it seems weird. Now we can call the Dutch. They are going to practice religious tolerance for a while, and they also did not want to be a kingdom. William of Orange was very specific that he did not want to be a king. He wanted to have people elect leaders, and he wanted to represent the people. And that's really revolutionary for the time. I mean, this is a solid 100 years, more so, almost 200, before America was doing the same thing. And they don't get enough credit for that. And so I think that it's important to acknowledge their work. They allowed economic growth. Also, they're going to set up a series of banking and financing such that by 1636, they were called the bankers of the world. And they're going to have a lot of land through their trading company, the Dutch East and West Indies trading companies. So they're going to be one of the richest countries globally for about a solid 100 years. So that's pretty important. They also artistically flourish. Their two main artists are going to be Rembrandt, who paints this one, and then this one, the girl with the pearl earring, is by Vermeer. Now that doesn't mean Philip's happy about it, right? Philip is devastated at this point. His armada's been defeated. He kept losing. Now he lost Holland, but he became more and more of a tyrant. He's like, everybody's questioning my rule. Well, I'm sick of it. You can't question me. And so he proclaimed himself to be an absolute monarch with divine right rule. Basically, he says, look, guys, stop arguing with me. I'm the king because my blood's holy. And God made me king. And you can't argue with God, so don't argue with me. That doesn't work so well. So he's going to have a lot of problems. There's like all these things here. But basically, the moral of the story, he is not successful at being this absolute, almost dictator, if you will. People in the Middle Ages, and then right after the Middle Ages, had experienced a decline of feudalism and the rise of cities, and they had a growing middle class, and so they had certain expectations, and he's not living up with it. But he's not going to be the only one. He's going to have a mighty powerful rival nearby who is doing similarly in his own country. And that's going to be the King of France. So here we transition to talking about France. Now, I'm going to warn you, I love France. So you know, I know we all are like, oh, France, World War II didn't go well, but I like France. So I like France. Now, their story is not too dissimilar from Spain, only they eventually are going to break out a guillotine in a couple of chapters, so it gets a little bit more fun there. So they randomly decided to pick up in 1559. In 1559, their king was a guy by the name of King Henri le Deux, which is Henri II. He's going to die, and his sons are going to rule one after the other, but they're not very strong. And behind the scenes, their mother, Catherine de' Medici, was the real power. This is the same de' Medici family that was super, super rich and powerful in Italy during the Renaissance. It's the same family, but now they're up in France. Once again, though, there's going to be religious problems, and they're going to try to solve them. In France, the French Protestants are called Huguenots. So Huguenots are the Protestants. The Huguenots and the Catholics are going to fight a bunch of wars in a rather short time span. I mean, you can see 30 some odd years, 8 different wars all over religion. And this is going to spiral out of control, with the most famous of the battles happening in 1572 at what was called the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. And this was just a 6-week slaughter of Huguenots in Paris. Basically, Catherine de' Medici's daughter decided she was going to marry a Huguenot by the name of Henri de Navarre. So super scandalous, right? Like this is like Romeo and Juliet stuff going on. You got a Catholic and a Protestant getting married in a country that doesn't accept religious differences. So in the wedding, literally people stormed in and started fighting. Um, and like it starts in the church, then it spews into the streets, and then it goes on for days and days. Henri de Navarre is going to survive the massacre, and when all the fighting is done, he's basically just going to proclaim himself to the throne. He's like, I'm in charge now because I was married to the princess. Take that. And so he becomes King Henry IV, because there was a Henry in between. Don't get hung up on that. And his last name, Henry de Navarre means of the Navarre region. So Henry of the Navarre region. His last name was Bourbon, so Henry Bourbon. So this starts the Bourbon dynasty in France, and the Bourbons are going to rule France for the next about 250 years. So that family and the Habsburg family are like the two main families in Europe at this time. So one of the first things that King Henry is going to do is he's going to issue the Edict of Nantes. This was a call for religious tolerance. You can be whatever religion you wanted to be, according to Henry. He didn't want to keep fighting over it. And that's a huge shift from how things had historically been in France. So that was a nice thought, but not everybody liked him. And so in 1610, a dude, I believe he was Catholic, decided he didn't like this radical change, jumped into Henry's carriage and stabbed him to death, and he died. So then his son is going to take over. His son is Louis XIII. There had been a bunch of Louis before. So Louis XIII is going to take over, but he wasn't ready to be king yet. I mean, his dad is suddenly assassinated and he's thrust into the throne without much preparation. And so Louis XIII is not very strong. And as such, he's going to name himself an advisor, this gentleman here, whose name is Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal as in the head of the Catholic Church in France at this time. If you've ever seen the Three Musketeers, same dude. The bad guy in Three Musketeers is going to be the advisor for Louis XIII. Well, that should tell you how well this works out. It doesn't. So Cardinal and Louis are going to try to increase Bourbon power by attacking the Huguenots, saying that the cities that the Huguenots lived in could no longer have protections in the form of walls, which today we're like, well, whatever, cities don't have walls. But back then they did, and that was a huge thing. It also shows that they're going to attack the Huguenots. The religious peace set aside by the Edict of Nantes was now going to be ignored. They argued that they were scared that Huguenots would form some sort of plot to try to kill Louis XIII, and so that's why. But it was a pretty weak argument. The other thing that they did is they're going to decrease the nobles' powers. They stopped letting nobles have castles, and instead they're going to encourage the growth of a middle class. They thought that would really that had nothing really to do with religion. That one was more trying to help France economically become more powerful. Again, the enemy, though, is going to be Philip. The Habsburgs didn't really like what was going on. They wanted to be the most powerful country, the most powerful family, and the Bourbons wanted to be the most powerful family. And so there's this huge fight that breaks out, where it's mostly France versus Spain, but it becomes known as the 30 Years' War, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. But a lot of people at this time were like, you know what? This is crazy times we're living in. And so one of the main skeptics is a guy by the name of Michel de Montaigne, who, A, created what we call the essay, so you can thank him for that. But B, he's also well known for having said, tout que c'est certain et qu'il n'est pas quelque chose qui est certain, which means all that's certain is that nothing is certain, which I guess is apropos for today's time. René Descartes is also going to emerge during this time period. He wrote a book called Meditations of First Philosophy. He is probably one of the most well-known of the Enlightenment thinkers. He's also a mathematician, a philosopher. He does a lot of stuff. His most famous saying is, Je pense donc je suis. I think, therefore I am. So anyways, all of this is ultimately going to open the door for the most powerful of all the French kings ever, King Louis XIV, who was so powerful that he recognized it. L'État, c'est moi. The state, it's me. I am the state. I am France. That's how powerful he was. He took over at the age of 5, which I always find quite amusing, but he's going to rule for quite some time. Richelieu's successor is a guy by the name of Cardinal Mazarin, and Mazarin is going to rule as a regent. Regent is a temporary king. Clearly, a 5-year-old is not well suited to be a monarch. And so the idea is you're going to have this cardinal who's going to kind of teach Louis how to be king, but then he's also going to kind of make some of the decisions for the country himself. And one of the main things he's going to do is he's going to end the 30 Years' War. With the war ending, France does emerge as the most powerful country in all of Europe. Spain is destroyed after that. So now Mazarin is going to try to strengthen the king by collecting a bunch of taxes, which is going to make the nobles result. This is all the same story over and over, right? Woohoo! I'm so strong. I know I'm going to prove it. I'm going to go take a lot of different lands. Oh, wait, now I need money. Nobles, give me money. No, it's always that type of thing. And there's a lot of reasons why. I mean, the nobles try to fight back. They were not successful at this point because they really just weren't well united and they got sick of fighting and so they quit. But it did really show the king, like, hey, you have to treat your people better or they will fight against you. So that's pretty good that he, like, you know, at this point, probably age of 7, realized that. And so when the cardinal dies in 1661, now Louis is going to take over. At this point, Louis is 23 years old. First things he does, weakens the nobles. He says, I'm not going to trust just nobles. I'm not going to have them as my councils anymore, but I'm going to have the intendant, which is a lovely French word, they're tax collectors. He's going to have them have more power. So the tax collectors have more power to do whatever necessary to get money. The nobles are going to be weaker. And again, he wanted to make France strong in 3 main ways: economically, politically, and culturally. He is going to rely a lot on Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who's the finance minister at this point. And basically the goal was make France be able to support itself and not need imports to be rich anymore. How did he want to do this? He wanted to give the government money and tax breaks to increase manufacturing, increase taxes on imports, increase immigration. You know, his idea was go to the French colonies, you know, regular people, and then you guys give us some taxes to work on that land, like rent or whatever. And so we'll get rich, but then we'll also have easier access to a lot of supplies. So this was Colbert's plan, but then Colbert died. So Louis like, you know what? Fine. I'm done with all this. I don't need any more advisors. I'm not going to try to make everybody happy. I want to do what I want to do. So the first thing he wanted to do was cancel the Edict of Nantes, right? Oh, religious tolerance. We don't need that. That was what was needed 100 years ago. We're good now. Well, no, not really. The artisans who were Huguenots were fearful that he was going to come after them. So a lot of the Huguenots just run away. They just leave. So now you're going to have drain in that regard. He also personally was super fancy in his life. He was so grandiose. He bought like the most magnificent clothes and really decadent foods. And there you go. He had 100 dudes just to dress him. Who has to have 100 dudes that he pays to put him in his fancy clothes? And probably the biggest example is that he built himself a new castle. And this castle, to this day, I mean, it's obviously one of the most important castles in the world. It was outside Paris at Versailles. Look at this castle. Isn't that fancy? And this castle at Versailles is going to be super, super important throughout history. We're going to come back to it in World War I. We're going to come back to it in the French Revolution. So just acknowledge that he has a fancy castle. That's a fancy castle right there. But he did do some good stuff despite that. He was a huge patron of the arts, so even though many artists were leaving the country, those who stayed behind, he paid a lot of money for. He himself was an opera and ballet. He was an opera singer and a ballet dancer. At one point, he danced in a ballet called The Sun King that was about him. And so then people just started calling him the Sun King. So if you ever hear of the Sun King, this is who they're talking about. He also paid a lot of money to a writer named Molière. And that really is what made Molière real famous. He was a playwright. And so he does do a lot artistically that's in good, but he does also do a lot of bad. right? He goes to a lot of wars, tons of wars. He's going to invade Spanish Holland. He's going to try to invade Dutch Holland at one point, and he's going to have to engage in a bunch of treaties to end these wars. But he really just liked to fight a lot of wars. And eventually, most of Europe got so sick of him that they're going to unite against him. So another Dutch guy by the name of William of Orange is going to become King of England, which we'll talk about later on. It's a descendant of the other one. So William of Orange equals a Dutch leader, but like serious Dutch leaders. They're going to create what's called the League of Augsburg. It's going to be most of Europe against France, like a formal declaration that we're all buddies and we don't like France. Well, France, they're sitting here like, well, we don't like any of you guys either. Oh, poop. There's a giant drought that hits the country. And the drought, which is a period of no rain, is going to leave the country unable to produce any foods. So now they have to turn to their allies. Oh, they don't have any. And no one wants to trade with France, so now the French are starving. Well, after Philip in Spain, there's going to be a couple other kings, and then Charles is going to be there. Well, after another Charles, because it likes to be confusing. After this Charles dies, he didn't have an heir. So in the midst of all this chaos, the king of Spain, this new king of Spain, is going to die. No kids left. Well, before he died, he promised it to another guy named Philip, because we like to make it confusing. So lots of Charles and Philips here. Don't get too hung up. Well, this Philip that he promised it to, a guy by the name of Philip of Anjou, was the Sun King's grandson. So now the French own France, but a family member is taking over Spain and all of Spain's empire. So now, kind of technically, it'd be real easy for France to claim Spain too. Well, that would be bad, right? And so now there's going to be a giant war that breaks out where all these countries were like, no, Philip of Anjou cannot take over the Spanish throne, right? So there's going to be this whole war over the line of succession in Spain. And all these other kingdoms that have nothing really to do with it are just uniting to keep France from taking over a second empire. This war is going to go on until 1713, and it ultimately is going to end with what's called the Treaty of Utrecht. And the decision basically was no, Bourbons cannot have both. Like, that's the moral of the story. So all these pink countries, they were the ones fighting against France. And then the whatever you want to call this, turquoise, those are all Spain and their friends. And if Philip had taken this over, which he's going to kind of take it over, but he's not allowed to unite with France. France would have just gained half of Europe, and that would have been a disaster. So basically the decision was Philip can take over, but he's not allowed to unite with his family. So the Bourbons cannot rule both. They can rule both, but not combine, is the best way to think of it. And Philip is going to have a bunch of Spanish leaders around him to try to maintain a distinctly Spanish feel to the Spanish throne. But Great Britain really is going to emerge at this point. They randomly gain some land from Spain. They gain the right to send African slaves to Spain's American colonies. And France is going to give some of Canada to Britain. So Britain, by winning this war more or less, is going to emerge as easily the most powerful kingdom. But don't tell France and Spain that, because they're going to continue to think they are. Louis is depressed and winds up dying. When he died, there was a massive celebration in his country. But the idea of an absolute monarchy is not going to die, and we're going to have two more Louis. Louis XV, who's going to further bankrupt the country, and then Louis XVI is the one who's going to get his head chopped off in 1790. So this isn't going to go so well for France. So stay tuned. We'll pick up with Central Europe tomorrow. Enjoy!